So another thing that happened recently, and this will probably be a surprise to you because we didn't discuss this, but this popped into my head. I wanted to say something about this. So longtime listeners of the show, and of course people who know me personally know that KISS is my favorite band of all time. You knew that, right? I think KISS is my all-time favorite band.
Is that why there's KISS all over your office?
That might be, yes.
KISS ornament hanging off your light?
That KISS is my favorite band.
KISS everywhere.
Paul Stanley said something recently, though, that I found rather shocking.
Really?
And I just wanted to address it for the a lot of guests that we've had on the show too are like KISS. So the subject comes up. But Paul Stanley said something that really surprised me. I was quite taken aback. He said in an interview, because he's doing a lot of interviews these days. He and Gene Simmons both are. Now that KISS is, they're not touring anymore. They did the end of the road tour.
They're doing the hologram tour.
They're still doing some stuff.
Right? Don't they have that hologram thing going?
That's coming later. They are doing a thing they're doing a big event in Las Vegas where they're going to play. So they're still active, but
they're not going to play. They're going to have holograms.
No, that's something else that's coming later. No, KISS actually is playing.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're still going to do some things here and there, but just not at like a full tour. That was the last actual getting on the road, going on tour. Yeah, they're in their 70s now.
Walking around in those boots.
Oh, yeah. Paul Stanley said in a recent interview that he feels in hindsight, because he's doing all these interviews talking about, looking back on KISS. He feels that in hindsight, it was a mistake in 1983 when they took the makeup off, because those four characters that they had created are so iconic, and he didn't think that anything that they did could ever live up to that. And so in hindsight, he feels that might have been a mistake.
What do you think?
Well, I was shocked that he said that. Because
why do you find it shocking?
Because it was a complete 180 from everything he's ever said on the subject. Because everything else, any other time, in any interview or even in his book, he talks about it. In his book, he talks about it a lot. The decision to do that, the reason they did it at the time was because, the makeup on a business level had run its course, it had seemed. KISS had gone from being one of the biggest bands in the world to having a couple tough years, where in the United States, they had really kind of fallen down and they needed to change. It was time for a drastic change in the band. And so it's like the way Paul talks about it in his book, for example, in his autobiography, he talks about the conversations he had about it with Gene, because he had to talk Gene into it. It was Paul's idea. And
I didn't know that.
And he had to talk Gene into it. And he said to Gene, he said, we have nowhere else to go. We have to do this, because both when they took the makeup off in 83 and when they put it back on in 96 for the reunion tour with the original lineup, in both instances, Paul had to talk Gene into it. In both
to put the makeup back on?
To put the makeup back on, he had to talk Gene into it too. In both times, he had to talk Gene into it. It was Paul who really wanted to do it. And, and obviously he did talk Gene into it. And the thing is, so Paul felt they couldn't continue on at that point in 83 with the makeup. They had to make this change. And Paul was like, not only will it kind of refresh the band, it sort of, it'll also prove to everybody, the haters, the doubters, the critics, that we're more than just the makeup and the flash and all that, and that we're a real band. Of course. So they took the biggest gamble of their career. Because they were rolling the dice. It was a scary time for the band. And Paul talked about that a lot in his book too. It was a scary time because this was a big risk, a big gamble, and they did the unmasking on MTV and whatnot. Turned out, and this is part of why it's so shocking to me that Paul said this recently, turned out it was the right call, because it brought them back. They'd had a couple of tough years, but they take the makeup off, and that first single, No Makeup, Lick It Up, ended up being a big hit. And they're back, they're on MTV now, and the song's on the radio, and Lick It Up goes platinum, and, so it really brought them back. Now, granted, during that non-makeup era of the band, they were never as big as they were during that original makeup era where they were one of the biggest bands in the world.
Yeah.
But they were still doing really well. That was a successful period. They had, all those albums went platinum. They were still able to do the arena tours, the big arena tours. They didn't have to scale down and play clubs or anything like that. So it was a pretty successful period. And so but they had to do it. Like they had to take that risk.
Did he qualify his statement as to why he thinks it's a mistake now?
He said that, looking back on it, he thinks that, they should have, maybe it would have been smarter to stick with that iconic image that they had created and not tamper with that. But he's never said that before. And I was just so shocked because he's always maintained up until recently that it was the right decision because that's what they had to do to save the band. And it worked. It did save the band. And so I was so shocked when I saw that, when he says, in hindsight, I think it was a mistake. I was like, really?
That's interesting.
Very shocking.
Well, as you
to
get
me.
older, you change your perspectives on how you see things. I mean,
Yeah.
I can look back on my youth and go, oh God, you were so ignorant.
But there's no way.
But
yeah.
we all make decisions. But it's, it is interesting because, I mean, like you said, it kept them viable. It kept them making money.
Yeah. It gave them
they
a whole
didn't
new.
have to downsize or anything. Like,
yeah. It gave them a whole new, it gave them a big boost,
yeah.
So
That's it. That is interesting.
yeah. Yeah. And then, and also too, if they had never taken the makeup off, the reunion in 96, when they put the original lineup back together and put the makeup back on, that wouldn't have meant nearly as much,
Yes, I agree.
So
I agree. It would have been like, yeah, whatever. Okay. Well, no, I mean, it would have been the original lineup, so there's definitely something to say there. But
it still would have been a little bit of a big deal.
It wouldn't have been as dramatic
Right.
as putting the makeup back on.
Right, exactly.
After what, a decade? Give or take?
13 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, the non-makeup era lasted 13 years.
Did you like the music better during that era, or what's your favorite era of KISS?
I love every era of KISS, but my favorite era is late makeup era, like the first half of the 90s when they were still out of makeup. That was my favorite era of KISS. But see, I mean, part of my perspective is when I became a KISS fan, they were already out of the makeup for a couple of years.
Ah.
It was actually Tears Are Falling.
So you were after the makeup.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I guess I kind of assumed you were in it from the beginning.
No. I was.
You were a late bloomer.
Well, yeah. When I really got into KISS, it was the video for Tears Are Falling was on MTV. It was in heavy rotation actually, and I still remember I was watching MTV one day after school, and the video for Tears Are Falling is on, and my dad comes home from work and he kind of pokes his head into the living room and says, "Maddie, who is that? Is that KISS?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Oh, I really like this song." And I said, "Oh yeah, me too. It's like my favorite song right now." And I guess he kind of made a mental note of that because then he got me that album for Christmas.
Aww.
He got me KISS Asylum was the album.
And a KISS fan was born.
And yeah, and that was, and I listened to that over and over, and that was when KISS became my favorite band. Yeah, so they were already out of the makeup anyway. So, but yeah, and then Paul had to talk Gene into it in '96 when, because they did the MTV Unplugged, where they were able to the two original guys who were not in the band at that point, Peter, Chris, and Ace Frehley, they were able to join in for a few songs.
Oh.
So that kind of got the ball rolling. Well, maybe we should put the original lineup back together and do a reunion in full makeup.
That makes sense.
But again, Paul had to talk Gene into it because Gene he was skeptical, and he was like, "Nah, I like the path we're on now. We should just keep going with this." And Paul said, "No, the fans want this," and
and he was right.
And he was right, because that ended up being that reunion tour that summer in '96. KISS and Metallica, those were the two top selling tours of the summer. That's how huge that was. I mean, it was massively successful. So
true. So they did the right thing in the end.
Yes.